My name is Kathy Pittelko. I have been in community with you since 2002. Until I saw Kathy Murphy's picture of the Jordan River, which is kind of more like a muddy creek, this was my image of where Jesus was baptized. It was a cool, comfortable place. I imagined myself there surrounded by friends and relatives, as you all are. I know why I am there. I am confident, and I'm in my comfort zone. That's a beautiful river. Then George Floyd was murdered, and the comfort and the coolness were stripped away. Because a young girl kept filming, I could no longer not see racism in my community. I couldn't not see what it did to a Black man who dared to be claustrophobic and resist the back seat of a police car. Racism was in full view, as if I were naked in the Garden of Eden. I believe it's time to talk about racism and white supremacy. It's time to talk about being anti-racist. It's time for us to leave our comfort zone. It is Lent. I journey in the desert to the land of many questions without answers that satisfy me. I walk this desert of introspection, having knowledge of George Floyd's death, to finally stare at racism and to own my part of racism, to own my realization that I am white and part of the system. Surely I am one of the good ones and not a racist, but I am white, and I've looked away way too often before. I can't look away any longer. Learning to be anti-racist involves interrogating myself, finding the core of racism and calling it out. I was programmed, without realizing it, that white was better. Black people say they were given freedom, but whites didn't give up being master. It doesn't have to be this way. My interrogation of myself starts with this question. Do you remember when you noticed you were white? I think I do. I am from the east side of St. Paul, practically a suburb back then. I was about 8 when my family went to Chicago on a vacation. We got stuck in traffic. I remember looking out the window at what seemed like 4 lanes of traffic on either side of the car, and all the occupants were Black. I remember my parents being tense. I'm sure they checked that the doors were locked. And as we spent time in Chicago, I saw that the people who cleaned our motel room and the other service jobs were Black. Someplace, my young brain absorbed my part in the system. They were Black, I was white, and they were cleaning for us. I did see children who were Black playing at the Museum of Science and Industry. I absorbed that too. I don't remember any conversation about Black people with my parents, but their silence was its own message. My Irish grandfather was vehement about his daughters being educated, that none of them would be Irish white washerwomen. But that seems to have another message of that service people weren't good enough. My programming goes way back. Now, I read the books about race that came from Adult Education Committee, like A Good Time for the Truth, Race in Minnesota, and The Cross and the Lynching Tree, along with many of you. But after George Floyd's murder, I began reading like my life depended on it. Racism, white supremacy, Anti-racism, white fragility, and white apathy were all new terms for me, terms that had been there for years in books that were written before George died, but all new for me. Why had it taken me so long to wake up? I'm now reading Me and White Supremacy through the Adult Education Committee book group. I find it hard to interrogate myself about incidences of my past. Anti-racism work needs to be deeply personal. When I'm challenged to do internal work, I can be more effective, powerful, and directed in my actions. Things I didn't notice before are more noticeable to me now. For example, the domestic terrorists who stormed the Capitol on January 6th were treated differently than those who protested for Black Lives Matter. Both the Me and My Supremacy book group and the anti-racism work group became places to truly talk about racism. In these two places, we share stories from our lives where we now see we made bad choices and hurt the feelings of someone well within our Black or white attitude. Another thing I've learned is the acronym BIPOC, a shorthand term for a group of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. People identifying as Black or Indigenous are singled out because of brutal treatment they received at the hands of our ancestors on the land now called the United States, though many of their sufferings are similar to all people of color. Some BIPOC people prefer the term BIMPOC, Black, Indigenous, multiracial or mixed, and people of color. And there are still some variations. In any case, one acronym is never sufficient to name the intricacies of a large and unique group of people. I'll continue my learning and my journey through Lent as I try to determine when I mean an individual Black person, a situation especially experienced by Indigenous tribes, or an injustice common to all people of color, and use the most exact language I can. I often hear, well, what can I do? And it remains a question I ask myself. Here are some actions that I have been trying and that are on my list. Read books about racism. Know the racial identity of the author. Read books by white authors who know and own their whiteness and their place of power. Read books by BIPOC writers who are willing to share the effects of generational oppression in their experience. Read books by Black, Indigenous people of color. Ask a librarian. Or go to our Spirit website. Our racial justice resource list is posted there for the public. Plus one was mailed this morning to all the Spirit members. Or ask the staff at Black Garnet, the only Black-owned female bookstore over on Lindale. They can give you a recommendation. Watch documentaries and movies about and by BIPOC. I've learned much about the Black church on the recent series by PBS. I also suggest the Finding Your Rich show on PBS, where Henry Louis Gates Jr. interviewed Pharrell Williams and Casey Lemon. Feel the intensity of Pharrell as he looks at the picture of the man who owned his great-great-grandparents. Pharrell ends with, I love this country. I want this country to love us the same way. And further on, he added, we need white advocates. We need allies. Research the neighborhood where you grew up from a real estate perspective. Could a Black family have bought a house? We were given a wealth advantage that Black people were not. Listen to the reparations issue differently. Listen for the dog whistle terms, which are the language of bias, such as affordable housing, Crime is going up. Immigration and crime, and not in my neighborhood. Notice if a story reported in the media is even-handed for Black, Indigenous, people of color. Tell someone if it does seem representative to you. Tell the media if it does not. Notice if a checkout service person of color is not busy and use that lane to check out. Extend a greeting, thank them for the risk they are taking. A few weeks ago, I was talking to a sales associate at Fresh Time, and I said I had heard that they would be offered immunizations because they were frontline people. She replied, I'm not getting a shot, and I don't get flu shots either, and I've never had the flu. Knowing the concerns of the Black community about being victims of medicine, I said, I hope you stay well. I am concerned for you being in contact with so many customers. She just stopped and she said, are you getting one? And I said, yes, I can hardly wait. I said, my mom was a nurse, my husband's a nurse, and I'm a big believer in immunizations. We parted with me again, wishing her well. The old me would have told her why I believed in immunizations, but now I've learned to say less, way less, and listen more. Perhaps the biggest action we can take is to talk about race, and that may be the most difficult of all. I learned in my reading that families of color talk about race every day, usually at supper. They gather to talk about their day, and it always comes up as a topic because people, usually white people, have hurt or belittled them in some way every day. These are microaggressions. For Lent, I'm asking you to give up silence and to talk about race every day. Learn what it is that we do as white people that makes Black people think it's too hard to be friends with us. Joan Chittister said we should all become friends with a person of color. People of color might say, we aren't worth it yet. Share what you've learned with someone else. Listen to their story and insight. Write to a legislator and tell them about action that needs to happen, but keep the conversation going. I pledge myself to continue these actions of dismantling my own white supremacy, and I invite you to join me. Choose Lent to read, pray, and interrogate yourself. Choose Lent to be uncomfortable in the desert without clear answers. Choose Lent to learn to be repairers of the breach of justice. Choose Lent to be aware that you are white and that life is different for Black, Indigenous people of color. Choose Lent to bring up the conversation and talk about race every day. Then we may know ourselves enough to possibly deserve to make a new friend who happens to be Black, Indigenous, or people of color. I don't think I can ever really lay this burden down. Amen.